Hi, Mr. Writers. We're entering autumn. It's actually raining here. Um, Today I wanted to talk about getting stuck. Getting stuck when you're in the middle of your story, and it's very frustrating. It's like gotten it all so far. You may have the whole novel planned out, but as you're writing, all of a sudden you just feel stuck. And the first thing I want to stress is that this is normal. You're not a failure as a writer. You're not a failure as a storyteller. You're not a story as a novelist. You're just not. That it's part of the process. And usually, what happens is there's something um, that you haven't thought out all the way. I think that's the simplest way to put it. Or you need to look at your story in a new light. Um, so I want to stress that this is not writer's block. You just don't know where to go next with your story. And you may feel as though you've written yourself into a corner with no way out, and you all of a sudden you're like bogged down with the details of what's happening now, and you sort of lost the thread of the story. So these are all fixable things. I, I just want to stress that these are fixable things. You're not a failure. It happens to everyone. Yes, it does. It happens to successful writers, multi published with multi published novels. This is something that happens to writers. So, the first thing I want you to do is to not give up, not think you're a failure, um, and just think about ways that you can kickstart your writing to get going with your story again. So that's essentially what I wanted to talk about today. I'm going to look at 5 different ways when you find this happening and you feel like you're stuck and you don't know where to go next. Look at 5 different ways that you can kind of kickstart your brain into getting back into your story. Um, Sometimes it's as simple as bridging to the next story event um, while you write. This is while you're writing. Um, you're at one point in the story and you don't know how to get to the next part. You've done all this planning and you know what's happening next, but you feel like there's this space here and you don't know how to get from this place in your story to that place in your story. All right. One of the easiest things you can do is write a scene where your protagonist reflects on what has happened so far. This is especially for mystery writers. This is a really good one. They just reflect on all the evidence they've gathered, all the suspect interviews that they've done so far, and they look at what what's happened so far. What is it that they actually know? And during that scene, your protagonist can make a decision that's going to lead them to the next part of your story. So, this reflection scene um, can really help you bridge between where you stopped writing and where you know the next place you want to be is. So, give it a try, see what happens. I do a reflection scene with your detective. Um, Another thing that you can do when is to go back and look at the character arc for your main characters. So give one of those characters a problem, some kind of obstacle they have to overcome, and it doesn't need to be a big obstacle, all right? But what you're going to do is reveal a growth step or a realization for that character, And oftentimes that realization will kick them into the next part of their story, because when they have that realization, they know that the next thing they have to do is whatever it is that comes into your head. So think about just giving them a problem and get them to come to a realization. And that's another way you can kind of move your story forward. So, what do you do about writing yourself into that corner, right? Um, it's time to stop. It is time to stop, not because you can't go forward, but it's time to stop and brainstorm. And brainstorm, I don't know, at least 5 other paths your character could take. Just sit down and start brainstorming it. Remember, brainstorming is non judgmental. He could do this, she could do that, he could do this could happen, that could happen. Just brainstorm some ideas um, about what could happen next. So, one of those ideas is probably going to click for you. Um, and you may have to do some revision of what you've written before when you do your editing. Don't stop to do that now. When we're writing, we're going forward with the story. Um, but you're going to get yourself out of that corner. So just brainstorm ideas. What's that? Raymond Chandler said, bring in a man with a gun when you don't know what to do. So this is kind of an elaborate way of bringing in a man with a gun. Okay, and the next thing is sometimes your story doesn't go forward. I mentioned this earlier because you're loading up your story with all this detail and information, and there's no action, there's no response to the action. So, yes, your story's going nowhere. So, what you can do with detail overload is double check that your detail moves the story forward. You may want to cut some of that detail out. See, because if that detail is just showing off how smart you know or how much you know about whatever, you probably don't need it in the story because it's not moving the story forward. Um, and instead of, let's see, how can I rephrase that? So you want to replace that extra detail. Going to take it down, to minimize it down, and replace it with action. And remember, dialogue is action. Um, and get your character moving again. Get your character doing something and leave all that detail just there and move on with the story. Okay, and then the 5th suggestion for when you're stuck is sometimes you can spend time in a specific section of your story and you kind of lose the narrative thread. You lose the narrative drive of that story. And the story's lost because it feels like the old adage of not being able to see the forest for the trees. You're stuck in the trees, right? Um, so at this point, use your story structure to get back into moving the story forward. And this is something I also recommend when your characters do or say something that you didn't expect and you're wondering how, with this new surprise element that they've brought to your story, how are you going to move your story forward? Is that think of the next major plot point in your story. It could be the midpoint of your story, or if you're past the midpoint, it could be the dark night when everything just is going wrong. Um, and think about aiming your story toward that next plot point instead of staying right here. Um, when you've lost the narrative drive. So all of a sudden, you, the writer, need to take that story and move it on by aiming at the next point in your story. You want to get there. So, what does your character need to do next to move your story toward that next big plot point? So, that's one way to think of it. Um, just think of Aristotle's 3-act structure, or I like for mysteries to think of the 4-act structure. Think of where you are right now, where your story is stuck. Where are you in that story structure? And then what's the next point you need to reach in your story? And it's sort of like we talked about before, bridging. We want to bridge from here to getting to the next part of your story. So now you're going to bridge to the next big plot point in your story, and just think about what your character needs to do to get themselves into that tough situation, or get themselves into that place in the midpoint where they feel like they just can't figure anything out. Um, so focus on moving them, because you're moving the story forward, moving your character toward that next plot point. And even though it feels like you're stuck, um, you're going to start gently turning the story back toward the storyline. Okay, I hope that helps. And then also, one more thing, and that's a little bit about MacGuffin. Um, I was working on a story, and I seemed to have nothing to say at that point in time. It was just like I was stuck, right? And and I really don't believe in writer's block. So I knew something was wrong with the story. And then I remembered Alfred Hitchcock's advice that every story needs a MacGuffin, and that's an object or a device um, that serves merely as a trigger for some action in the plot. And once I found the MacGuffin for that scene where I felt like I didn't know where to go next, um, the dialogue I was writing came to life, and the story moved on, and how I also saw how the MacGuffin would trail through that story. So I hope all of these suggestions help. If you find yourself staring at a blank page and not knowing what to write next, take a look at your story. All right. So look for the missing pieces and the overall structure. And I find for me, going to the overall structure, looking at where I am now in that story structure, and just aiming my story toward that next big plot point is going to help me get back on track. Okay, I hope that helps. And once again, if you have any questions, please put them in the comments. I am happy to hear from you, and I will see you next week.